like to thank everyone for making the trip, whether it's a few miles or a few thousand miles, to our first panel. Okay, so the conference was organized by myself, Martine Sanchez-Jankowski, and Lynn Chancer, who are sitting there. And I myself am a senior researcher at the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues, which is part of the Berkeley campus, as Martine was the director of the Institute. And as you know from last night, if you were there, the conference is sponsored by Hunter, CUNY, and the Berkeley Institute. And we have funding from the Sloan Foundation and the Gerald Huff Fund for Humanity. And so we're going to hear today about the technological developments that will form the basis for the rest of the conference. And so we have 4 wonderful presenters to talk to us about some recent technological innovations. And we're going to start with Dr. Pamela Silver from Harvard, who is a systems biologist and a bioengineer. Dr. Silver holds the Elliot and Onie Adams Professorship of Biochemistry and Systems Biology at Harvard Medical School. And she's known for her pioneering work in synthetic biology. So we will have her talk for 25 minutes. I think we have time for that. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Good morning, and good morning, people on Zoom. I want to think about how we make a beautiful, sustainable world by 2050 for the 10 billion people that will be occupying it. And I also want to mention that in that time period, maybe there'll be people on Mars even. And the technologies we develop for going to Mars are going to be some of the same ones that we need to sustain a beautiful life on Earth. Now, this conference is about technology, and I want to do a little framing through the lens that was mentioned last night of 1930 forward, and thinking about the early part of the last century where synthetic organic chemistry was the technology of the day, and that brought us, of course, nylon, plastics. Remember the film The Graduate, right? Plastics. Look where that got us. But lots of things that have been, I think, good for the growth of the world in a better place, and that led to the better living through chemistry, which was a theme that I grew up with. Now, mid-last century, I'm a child of Silicon Valley, and so this is very intimate for me, is the development of the microchip, which then led to the technological revolution that we've been living through. I want to argue that the next thing is the engineering of biology, and that is what is going to transform life on as we know it. We understand so much about biology given the research of the last many 50 some odd years that we are in a place to begin to treat the engineering of biology sort of like synthetic organic chemistry. And so hence we call what we do synthetic biology. So let me give you some of the impacts that we have already experienced in this century around the precise engineering of biology. Within the environment, I will talk a little bit about some of our work on carbon sequestration, huge advances in agriculture, of course, health. We're living that dream. Commodities, you are seeing advent of so-called green commodities. Has anyone had an Impossible Burger? That is a product of genetic engineering. It's labeled GMO. But there are many other products of both high and low value commodities. And then I want to interject safety into this conversation, both safety in terms of keeping us safe from what's going on in the food supply, for example, and conversely thinking about how we safely deploy the technology. Okay, so I think that we are living a global biology lesson. I'd be willing to challenge you. And the audience is a very diverse age here, but I don't know the age online, but everyone, all your parents, for those younger, know what mRNA is. They know what an antibody is. That's amazing. So if nothing else, I mean, we've made this great vaccine, but we've also started to put the language of biology into the world. So people can, and this is so hard to do, right? And so this has been a really a wonderful case where you can imagine people at all levels. Is there a problem? Yeah. Oh, at all levels using the language of biology. Now, I want to mention the development of the mRNA vaccines. This is a slide from my friend Melissa Moore, who's the chief at Mrna, which illustrates the speed, the amazing speed at which they were able to get to clinical trials for the vaccine that many of you have enjoyed. Why is that? And I have a little bit of a personal vignette on this. Now, there's a tendency to say, oh, the dark state, we weren't ready, right? We were behind. I want to give you a different point of view. That, in fact, the US government has been funding research in this space for at least, probably longer than I can remember. But I was involved in a DARPA program. It started, I think, about 15 years ago. And the pre-Mrna was part of that program. And the dedicated program manager of that program believed in them and supported them. And I just have to give a shout out for Dan Wattendorf. He's very reserved, but he made this happen. And it gave me a window into how it's DARPA, it can be perceived as defense-based, but that it was amazing. Now, there's another thing that happens here, and that is what happened in the first couple days. So how was Mrna able, so they were ready at the right time. If it had been 1 year earlier, maybe not. But what was remarkable was the speed at which they could synthesize the messenger RNA that became the foundation for the vaccine. So 2 days, right? Amazing. So that's transformative. If you're thinking of a protein-based vaccine, it's going to take a lot longer. So this technology is literally transformative. Now, we heard some about open access, openness, and communication last night, and I want to give you the ultimate example of where open communication basically saved the world. So the sequence, there's a lot of details I'm going to maybe get wrong here, but the sequence of SARS-CoV-2 is key to that vaccine, right? It was sequenced in China, could have waited till they published it, right? It goes to Nature, it could have taken a few months. Imagine where we would have been. But instead, through the process of communication through the internet, this person in Australia received the sequence from his Chinese colleagues and posted it on Twitter. Is that amazing or what? And so everybody had access, including Mrna. And so they went from a sequence that was posted on social media to the first day of synthesizing that mRNA. Now, you might say, how do you believe the sequence? How do you know this is real? And it turns out their technology was so fast and so cheap, it didn't matter. They could give it a shot. So that's another underpinning of an amazing technology. And by the way, I have no interest, no personal interest in Moderna. But I just was stunned at the idea that you would take a risk from something you read on Twitter. And we're going to see more and more of that. You can also argue the negative side of that, but let's go with the positive. Now I want to give you a flavor, my real world flavor of the vaccine situation. Every year I like to go off somewhere remote on a sailboat, and it was not possible during COVID, so I took my first trip a few months ago, about a month ago or so, down to some remote islands in the Grenadines in the Caribbean. And as you move, it's a little bit of a hassle. It turns out as you move from every island, which is a separate country, you have to get a new COVID test. And that's a PCR test, except for coming back into the US, which is, so this is a COVID testing clinic, I think on Union Island. And what's interesting, this is the sign. Notice it says the China coronavirus. So these are the perspectives you get outside the US. This was a PCR-based same-day test. This is the wonderful doctor who comes to this outdoor clinic and gives us the test. If we want, in other islands, they would just come to the boat. And this is what, oops, shoot. What happened there? Oh my God. This is what the clinic looks like. Outdoors, note the turtle sitting under there. These are some of my co-mates on the boat after their PCR test. So for me, this was like a magical moment because I was just starting in molecular biology when PCR was discovered and developed, and look, now it's being practiced in the developing world. So for me, this was like magic. Okay, so let me just frame a few other ideas that are on my mind and what I'm been a little tiny bit about some contributions we've made. So thinking about programming life, I think for me the key things are the ability. What does life do? It grows, it uses energy, it can make energy, and it repairs itself. And so why can buildings be made of wood, but they can't repair themselves? Imagine what I want to dream about are, why can't your clothes repair themselves or clean themselves? This is a house made of living matter, but why can't that house do photosynthesis and regrow? So I see the challenge, the grand challenge in this idea of using biology, and this has been the underpinning of synthetic biology from day one, is how do we make the engineering of biology easier so everyone can do it, more predictable and faster? And I go back to the Moderna case. It's the perfect encapsulation of what you want from the engineering of biology. But if you're going to build the house, you've got to go to a different scale and complexity. And so we're still taking baby steps here, but we are making forward progress towards some of these goals, which I think will be realized over the next 30 years. Now, why is that? First of all, DNA is the substrate of biology, so everything you do, well, you could say RNA in the case of Moderna, but you still need nucleic acid synthesis. And the cost of making DNA has dropped and dropped faster than Moore's law. This is the cost of DNA sequencing, my apologies, has dropped faster than Moore's law. Now, as you know, or may not know, we can, in principle, sequence every human on the globe. There are projects to sequence every organism on the earth. This is just remarkable. Think about it. DNA, the structure of DNA was solved, oh God, 60 years ago or so. And now we're talking about knowing everyone's genome, everything's genome. That in turn leads to an enormous amount of information that can be used for engineering. Which gets me to the red line, which doesn't look as impressive, but is pretty good, and that is the drop in the cost of synthesizing DNA, which is the substrate for engineering biology. So now, and you've probably heard about this, you can synthesize a virus. It's no problem. It's about, depending on who's doing it, it's about a penny a base pair, so you can do the back, or actually in some cases about 0.1 cents a base pair, depending. So you can do the back calculation of how cheap would it have to get before I can synthesize a human chromosome, for example. We can now synthesize a bacterial genome for under $1 million, and that price will continue to go down. So we have we have ideas, we have a lot of knowledge. So what are some of the problems that need to be solved? Well, I think we all agree that energy is one of the global challenges. So we think about global energy needs and that growth in population, that means increased consumption and need for energy, and also a number of those users are going to be in the developing world. Now we, although I think solar is changing this up, but in general have relied on a centralized form of energy production and distribution. That's been the gestalt in the US and other developed countries. The question, I think, going forward as we develop new technologies around energy, that we are going to think about more how to have those be distributed, available to all, and actually have a low cap expenditure. So that's something that I think biology can help deliver on. So remember, biology is the best user of sunlight to make stuff through the process of photosynthesis. So I'll just touch on something that we've done in my laboratory, which was to create a bionic leaf, which is the interface between chemistry and biology. So this is a case of real interdisciplinary work. It was done together with my awesome colleague at Harvard in the chemistry department, Dan Nocera, who invented an electrocatalyst that in response to light will carry out the water splitting reaction. That's what a leaf does. That's key. Now, what do you do with that? So it's sort of a storage problem, right? And so there are bacteria that are capable of taking hydrogen, fixing CO2, and growing. So we can create an integrated system that is all in one place, can take in light or any kind of energy. So the energy delivery can be remote and delivered in the form of electrical to the leaf, which can then grow biomass. So this is still sort of the gold standard in this space. These numbers may not look that impressive to you, but if you look at CO2 reduction efficiencies, plants, it's about 1%. Algae, cyanobacteria are the natural winners. I have 3% here, but they can get up to 8%. And the bionic leaf still wins at about 10% efficiency. Now, that gets me to another huge problem that was the great savior of the last century, a technology to develop fertilizer, which of course brought us the great revolution in agriculture of the last century. Unfortunately, the process for making nitrogen-based fertilizers now is the culprit, right? It requires high heat. it's CO2 emitting, the so-called Haber-Bosch process. So we really should find substitutes for this. So what we can do is take our same bacteria in the context of the bionic leaf, and they will also fix nitrogen. Different bacteria, but same idea. And I want to just give you one example. This is radishes, which were one of the NASA favorite plants, grown in the Harvard Arboretum. And the ones on the far right are the ones that got our bionic leaf-grown bacteria, and they're clearly bigger. And I could go on with a lot of anecdotes about how these bacteria can support agriculture, but better yet, we were able to form a new company called Coolabio, which is just doing amazingly at trying to develop this technology for use by farmers. It's been fascinating to talk to farmers and understand what they have to deal with. And so it's not a simple case to change up how you do farming. And that's another thing to think about when you think about technologies. Now I want to end with a few inspirations here. This from some work I did together with Neri Oxman at MIT. At the Media Lab. So Neri is a designer, but thinks a lot about science, and so together we thought the dream, as I said, would be living wearables. So imagine if you had clothes that were photosynthetic. Now we didn't get there, but Neri has designed these clothes structures that can be infused, in this case, with photosynthetic bacteria, which is shown on the upper right. The lower right is an example of something that she designed that was actually on the Paris runway. And this design here is what we infused the photosynthetic bacteria into. That's one idea. The other one that we really are working on is imagine, do we have enough knowledge to make freeze-dried organs or freeze-dried whole organisms? And this has enormous implications. This is an example of a plant that has been freeze-dried. It's called a resurrection plant. You can actually buy it on Amazon. And this is a time lapse of growing it in our laboratory after you add water, and it will come back to life. So this is a technology that nature already does. But imagine the transformation if we could freeze-dry organs or freeze-dry eggs. So the problem with the cold chain, which you've heard a lot about, could really be addressed with freeze-drying. Now, I know that this conversation will lead to a lot of questions about misuse, and we can have, I'm sure we will have a lot of discussions about that. But let me give you a framing here that compels me. And first of all, I am not bothered by GMOs. I'll just say it up front. In fact, I want to open an all-GMO restaurant in Cambridge. That's my dream. But let me be clear that with regard to GMO food, you, especially us coastal elites, can make a choice. We can choose to shop at Whole Foods, pay more money, get our wonderful non-GMO, or we can choose things like the Impossible Burger. We can also, it's a little, I think there's a social issue here as well with being anti-GMO, because in the developing world, GMO is going to be critical. So I'm often a little critical of my coastal elitist colleagues about GMOs, because I think there is a social responsibility about thinking about their deployment in the developing world. But this is a choice we at least can make. However, let's think about when you go to the doctor. You're in pain. Let's say you're in chronic pain. You suffer from Crohn's disease or colitis, and the doctor says to you, I can treat your chronic pain. You know, you're not going to be asking a lot of questions about where that drug comes from. I'd be willing to bet you don't ask any, unless it doesn't work, right? So I'm going to offer that a real key to socialization around the engineering of biology really lies in the health realm. And some way to integrate those two with sort of real-world applications, I think has some opportunities. All right, so let me just conclude. So in case you were wondering where the money comes from to do this work, there is national investment. As I mentioned, DARPA has been one of the main funders since the last 20 years. I did a DARPA ISAT report in 2002, I think. So, by the way, we laid out a roadmap for synthetic biology then. So that was 20 years ago. It's been a little slow going. However, I'm pleased to say that we reached most of the milestones on that roadmap. NSF was the supporter of a SynBio research center, which is a big deal when NSF puts forward that, and DoD has recently made an initial investment in a manufacturing is a big deal here. And so DoD has realized that and made at least an initial investment in biomanufacturing. And there are a number of private organizations that fund this work as well. So I want to end with a few other sociological issues. So why now? So there's an enormous fascination with this field from students. I get letters from high school students, can I please come work in your lab? Which resonates for me because, as I said, I grew up in Silicon Valley, and so I got to go work in people's labs then. So I want to help all these. I get 8th graders. It's just amazing. And so there's this huge interest, and there's also a huge interest in building the bioeconomy. So there's a huge investment interest. And we were listening last night about issues around supply chains and moving things around. And of course, if you're growing it at home, and it really is a carbon neutral process, it begins to solve a lot of those problems. So we have a generation also, I believe, I'm hopeful, that really does want to solve real world problems. And I'm going to point out climate change. And as I said, we also know a huge amount about how biology works. We don't know everything by any means. So we need to keep funding basic research. We need to learn more. Opportunities to combine disciplines, machine learning is key here. And I want to end with, as this grows, and I think this will resonate for the AI ML people, but a need for a trained workforce. We are desperate. I mean, I work in the center of the universe in Boston in this area. Now, you guys from Silicon Valley can argue with me, but I think I'm at the center, feel like I'm at the center of the universe. And that said, the employment, as you have industry growing, remember, every startup with a Series B has 200 jobs open. Layer on top of that, pharma, Moderna, 800 job openings. And then us poor academics, what are we going to do? Where are the new ideas going to come from? We are in trouble here, and I don't have a solution. But I'm thrilled at what Hunter's doing. I'm thrilled at any efforts. But we have a national problem. So I will end there. Thank you.
Totally fascinating, and a great start to our panel. So we will hear from Dr. Anita Raja, who is a CUNY professor, and she teaches computer science at Hunter College, and she's a member of the doctoral faculty in computer science at CUNY as well. And so now we'll hear about the AI side of things.
Thank you, Jeremy. And thank you all for being here. And I'm excited to be part of this conference. My talk today is, to introduce the definition of artificial intelligence and what it covers in the current day world and the challenges that we are facing so that we are prepared for the future. So, next slide. Yeah, I should, sorry. Yeah. So I'll start off with the definition because there is, I think, a little bit of confusion of what artificial intelligence is and what machine learning is. And I'd like to make a distinction that this is all not, the same general definition. So let's start off with AI. So what is AI? So AI is the study and design of intelligent agents, where an intelligent agent is capable of taking perceptions from the environment, doing some sort of computation or thinking, and then acting on the environment, right? So that's that entity which is capable of doing this kind of processing of information. Machine learning, on the other hand, a simple definition would be pattern recognition and the ability of a system or a set of algorithms to improve as you give more data. And so an AI system could have several machine learning algorithms within it, because the AI system may have to do understanding of language, it has to do planning, it has to cooperate with other agents. And so, at least in my view, coming from the AI side, I see machine learning as part of an integral part of AI, but not the complete definition of AI. So we'd clearly, just like Pamela discussed, we are in an interdisciplinary area within AI, and I think even from the very foundations of AI, we have cross-cut economics, we have to bring in ideas from philosophy or sociology, engineering, of course, and now some of the projects I will talk about is how it relates to biology, and clearly when we talk about policy matters, how does that relate to law and so on. So mathematics, of course, is the foundation of both AI and machine learning as well. So, very important, I think. I'm glad yesterday Paul talked about the history, and I wanted to make sure I included the history of AI so that we can talk about the ups and downs, the hype, and the not so great times or the winter of AI, as it were. So AI basically started around 1940 to 1950. I think one of the new ideas was when McCullough and Pitts tried to model the brain using a Boolean circuit. So that was one of the parallel works that was happening, in addition to Alan Turing writing about computing machinery and intelligence. And that's where he defined what AI would entail. So it's going to have modules which deal with language, recognition, knowledge representation, and learning. So at least he was able to identify some of the parts that would be integral to AI. And then from 1950 to 1970, I think there was a lot of enthusiasm. In fact, this is where there was like the early AI programs, Samuel's checkers games, where there was this initial AI system beating a human in the checkers game. And we would officially say the birth of AI happened at Dartmouth in 1956. And this is a famous quote from John McCarthy and Claude Shannon from this Dartmouth workshop. So it was a group of scientists who got together and said, we think that a significant advance can be made in AI if we work on it together for a summer. And they did work on it for a summer, but here we are, many decades later, still trying to understand how do we move the needle on AI. But at least we got the train started, and so AI became an industry. But as the scientists started understanding the complexity of solving AI, we went through AI winter. So there was a DARPA funding at that time, and in fact, when people realized that we can't just imitate human intelligence, within a few months, and how far we are from that, there was like this dip in funding, and in the 1990s, though, I think the people were continuing to work. There was a resurgence, and happily, scientists were able to move from what were very strong assumptions about linear dependencies and so on to bringing in probabilistic approaches and in integrating uncertainty in the reasoning of the systems that we were building. So that's where we started modeling our systems more to what the real world had to handle. So AI became more scientific, and we would call this time when agents were introduced and learning systems were built as AI Spring. And then since 2012 to present, I think big data became the big thing, and I think the fact that we had both computational hardware which could match the data that was being produced, we took the idea of neural networks, which were there between 1950 and 1970, and could make it practical. That's what really was the turning point where AI became relevant to industry. And once we found that killer application, I recall being just finishing up graduate school and all these discussions in our main AAAI conference on what is the next killer application to get AI out there. We have these great ideas. How do we get people to integrate that into their systems? And it was this notion of big data, neural networks, and deep learning that made that happen. But of course, now we are moving through with production level breakthroughs at many different angles, which is exciting. So AI is flourishing, and as you all know, we need to have these systems, though, that have to have social understanding and cooperative intelligence. So my own background is from distributed artificial intelligence, which interestingly was renamed multi-agent systems during AI winter, because only then could we get funding. And this was pre-grad school for me, but it was a smart move because we could continue working on systems, and then when AI came into favor, we were like, we are back to distributed AI, but we were doing the same, researching the same questions at that time. So how do we get systems that understand the context that they are in, but also can cooperate with each other and with humans to do well in problem solving? So some of the applications, where these AI systems need to interact and rapidly and in a complex way would be ending poverty and hunger, reducing inequalities, promoting clean energy, protecting the planet, offering quality education, and in general, leading to better health. Examples would be how do we get robots to help nurses to deliver stuff to the various rooms in the hospitals, right? So my own work, and I also have done work both in health, and that I'll talk about today, and in traffic, how do we get to reduce congestion, take advantage of connected autonomous vehicles and self-driving vehicles while humans are still on the road as well, and do it in an environmentally friendly way. So these are some of the research questions that they are working on. And my own North Star in research has been this idea of building cooperative agent societies. So how do we get intelligent software agent systems to work with humans, although my emphasis has been on the intelligent agent side. Shiwali will talk about the human and the intelligent agent connection, which is a nice complement to having the two talks today. But these agents need to be operating in environments which are called bounded rational. And here's this notion from economics, right? So Herb Simon defined bounded rationality that if a system is going to do some computation, but does not take the cost of the computation into account, then the solution that you come up with is not operational. And so this has been injected throughout my work. So I bring in this notion of meta-level reasoning, where an agent is, or the software system is able to look at the problem-solving process from an end-to-end, non-myopic fashion, instead of just the single tasks that you're doing, and trade off the resources. We are not only bounded rational, we are also under resource bounds. So you have to complete your problem within the set computational time, the computational processing costs, but also other resources that are needed to solve the problem. And so when we look at this from a single agent perspective, or when we have multiple agents working together in a cooperative way to solve problems, it's important to think about these resource bounds and also uncertainty. So one of the projects that I've been working on for the past decade is in the area of health, and so it has been, how do we use machine learning algorithms and eventually build decision support agents to predict and prevent disease? And specifically, we've been looking at the preterm births of babies, so babies which are born less than 37 weeks. So this was funded by NSF and then by NIH more recently. And what we have found out is that there are great data sets out there because NIH runs all these studies, but how do we leverage these data sets? And because there is a huge cost in the initial part of getting these data sets, which is data cleaning. How do you take this data and massage it sufficiently enough and extract the information that you need so that it is relevant for machine learning, right? So this is a team with Columbia University, Hunter College, and with CUMC, Columbia University Medical Center. So we work very closely with the experts in OBGYN so that we have their input. And I think this is a critical part of any research, that you don't want to be working in your own silos, and just the amount that we learn from them and vice versa has been tremendous. And it does take time. It's been over a decade. So we have been making progress in the prediction of preterm birth, but more recently, we took our algorithms, which we had developed for improving the prediction, which went up by about 20% from what the state of the art was by bringing in our algorithms to participate in a data challenge that was funded or hosted by the NIH. And they, again, what they were trying to get was both industry and in academics to use a data set that had resulted from a huge NIH study, which we were already using as part of our project, fortunately, to come up with new solutions. So are there new methodologies that could help us in identifying patients who are at the risk of morbidity, so mothers who have the high risk? And the question that we then took our algorithms and applied to was preeclampsia. PTB, preterm birth itself, is not a maternal morbidity per se, but that's the generalization, our understanding of the data and understanding of the algorithms could allow us to do. And so we were one of the 7 teams who happily were able to win this data challenge. And so we came up with new ways of analyzing the data to identify the mothers who are at the highest risk, but also who are at the lowest risk of preeclampsia. And why is that important? Because if you are at the highest risk, you want to make sure you get the treatment that is needed. But if you're at the lowest risk, you want to make sure you don't have all these extra tests or visits or the added stress that could eventually lead to the disease itself. So happily, our work was recognized, and we are continuing to do work on this. So I just wanted to give a brief description of what the data set is like, so you get an understanding of the scale of this. So we had the data. The study was run from 2010 to 2015, data of about 10,000 first-time moms, nulliparous women. And that's one of the most difficult sets, especially for preterm birth, to do prediction. So that's something we wanted to focus on, because usually the indicator, for instance, for preterm birth is whether the mother had a prior preterm birth, and that just increases the risk and the care that would be given. So we were happy that we could get this data set. We were first-time mothers, and there was a significant number of people, mothers who had received, who had resulted in spontaneous preterm birth, which is another outcome which is very difficult to predict. So this was an important data set for us, and the data had been collected over 4 different visits. So there were about, I think, yeah, so there were 3,000 features from each visit, and a feature would be information about their blood pressure or their temperature, the ultrasound information, any other surveys that, about their socioeconomic information. So we had clinical, socioeconomic information, and most importantly, we also had genetic information for the first time in our study. So we were able to combine this data and push forward the prediction results. And my interest specifically is not, okay, great, you're able to predict who's at high risk, so what can you do about it? And so I brought my background in scheduling and planning to look at prevention, right? So how do we take the necessary steps? And specifically, I'm interested in doing early prediction so that you have enough actions or contingency plans to handle what is happening to the patient. So I won't go into all of the detail, but it took us 1.5 years just to take this data and clean this up so that, again, it was amenable to the kinds of algorithms that we had to handle. And some of the issues where there would be contradicting data, there's missing information, because this is real world data. So even that, handling those issues has resulted in new algorithms for handling missing data that we were able to share with the community. So in terms of results, so what I'm showing here is we compared for the challenge those who were going to have preeclampsia versus those who did not have hypertension at all. So preeclampsia is related to blood pressure, and our algorithms were able to show that we had a significant improvement in performance when we were able to use these machine learning algorithms. The other things that we were able to do, and I have a couple of slides, images here, is that, I think this one. Yeah, so these were, can we identify features? When a clinician is looking at a patient, they might have 5 or 6 features to figure out who's at risk. But what machine learning is able to do is give you more details about the important features that we're handling, and also rank order them, that this is what you need to look at. And finally, we also were able to look at thresholds to give us early indicators. So one of the results that I'm showing here is that if the BMI was about 26 for the patient at this particular point in time of their visit, it's actually, often you'd be like, oh, it's 26 and they're pregnant, it's okay. But what we saw from the data was that could be an indicator that we should take care of. And specifically in our work, it was important to look at subgroups. And I think this is an important issue to consider when we come up with machine learning results, that you don't overgeneralize what you're looking at. Because we had patients from from diverse backgrounds in terms of race, in terms of age, in terms of socioeconomic situations. And so right now our analysis is, how do we break this data down so that we are giving the right prediction and the options for the right set of patients? So this is exciting research that is ongoing. So we want to, again, that's part of what I'm saying, we want to build a variety of models so that the same cohort can be given a chance to both emerge and capture the different subtypes of preeclampsia. Another highlight of this work was when we did produce the correct model, we wanted to make sure that it's fair to to the group that we are studying. And what we noticed was there was inequality. And I'm not going, again, these are more technical details, but what I want to emphasize is that we found out that there was a high false positive rate for the African American population in our group. And that's because there's a smaller representation of that group in the training set, but when it came to prediction, we were actually giving a higher rate of what was actually happening among the patients, which means a patient could be falsely diagnosed with PE, with preeclampsia, and the corresponding actions could be taken. And so we have to be very careful when we build these models to make sure is it fair, and there are existing methods and things that we have developed to ensure that we take the model and just don't implement it immediately, but to see that it's fair and balanced. And so we were able to then fix the issue by determining these cutoffs. And the other thing we found out was the Asian American population was being underdiagnosed. So while the black race was being overdiagnosed, there was underdiagnosis of another group. And again, just because they're not fairly represented in the data set, it's not an equal representation. So these are, I think, long-term lessons to take for all of as we work on bringing in machine learning and eventually decision support systems and AI into this work. A second project that I work on is this idea of connected autonomous vehicles. So again, as I said, I come from a distributed AI background, and the key idea here is this notion of selfish routing. So what is selfish routing? It's the desire of each driver or each vehicle on the road to optimize their own path. And because everyone is doing that, that is actually bad for the entire society. And we can sort of map this to a lot of different applications, right? So when you are not coordinating with other agents and there's a limited resource, and there are a lot of interesting paradoxes on what happens with selfish routing, where everyone, for instance, for us it's I-95, or if we take Route 1, everyone goes to the highway and instead doesn't take the alternate routes, and hence the highway is super congested, right? So some of the things that we were trying to bring in is how do we take this idea of connectedness in vehicles, especially now as we move into self-driving cars or partially self-driven cars, and also this idea of platooning. Not so great for New York City, but let's think about it, in the big highways of Texas or something, where we can get groups of vehicles to work together, to sort of coordinate together and be at very close. So there would be a lead vehicle, and it determines the path for the other vehicles that are part of this platoon, and they are very, very closely connected, and we can talk about long-term routing plans. So that's work that we have been doing. Again, a lot of numbers here, but what we're doing in simulation is looking at different car following algorithms, and we were able to show that by cooperating, the average speed of the agents actually increases and the average travel time drops, while we can also improve fuel usage and reduce the emissions. So this was done in this complex simulation called Sumo, and we are bringing in multiple agents, each car not knowing what the other car is going to do, but then they communicate with each other so that they are able to come up with a solution which is desirable for the entire group. So having discussed some of the projects, what are issues? I've already mentioned this issue of bias and making sure there's fairness. We also want to address the issue of lack of transparency as we build these decision support systems, and accountability of the algorithms. Especially when it comes to health or major finance decisions, and you're making recommendations whether someone should get a credit loan or not. You want to make sure your decisions are transparent and so that you're being accountable. So yeah, I think I'll just skip through. So these are just some examples, where we want to bring in policy and where we have this social network of systems which need to work together in a successful fashion. So here are some ideas. Maybe I should, let me pause this and go to the previous slide. Of some ideas that I'm currently looking at to address these issues. So as I mentioned already, we are whenever we build our models, we are checking for fairness, but I'm sure there are, broader ways to consider this in terms of societal impact and policy. Here's an example. I'll just let you watch this simulation and then I will describe this. So the goal of this boat is to complete the circuit, which is being described up here, right? So it's a race, and the maximum utility that the boat can get is by going through this circuit. But instead, what this boat has learned is by, the other option is you can also get some utility by encountering these turbo pellets, as it were. And so what the boat decided is to just skip out of the race itself and just go through and pick up all the pellets that are out there. And it was able to maximize its utility, right? So what is the concern here? I mean, clearly there is a concern. So instead of just putting it up there, I'll just, yeah. So what is value alignment? And this is just a simple example of where this is, there's X that you would like your agent to be following, that the goal for your agent is X. Instead, it has decided to go and figure out an X prime and maximize its utility. Because when it comes down to how we define the goal for an agent, we are saying, here's the problem, and what we want to do is we have defined how you can get utility, and we narrowly say you have to maximize the expected utility to win this game or to do well in this as a system. And that is not sufficient. As we build more complex problems, we need to make sure that there's an alignment of what is considered useful value for the agent and what the human or the designer would like the system to do. And there are multiple ways that are suggested. So Stuart Russell has one of the ideas that has come out from his lab is when we do value alignment, you don't have to perhaps define the details of the human preferences, just at a high level, provide the preferences to the agent. And there's this whole area of inverse reinforcement learning, where then the agent will figure out, okay, what is it exactly that the human wants to do? And this is important when we direct an agent to do things which are mission critical, especially, right? If it's health or if it's defense, because it could just say, oh, this is my goal and at the cost of ethical decision making, or the cost of the environment, or the cost of comfort of others. So I think giving a little more freedom, that's one way that one could move forward with value alignment, so that the agent has the freedom to figure out, okay, what is it that would help me get the preference of the human rather than being too specifically defined. There's also a lot of work, as you know, the issue of ethics, especially in the past 5 years, as we have seen AI being used in industry, there's been a lot of discussion in our community. Happily, it's being integrated into our education. I think having students not only be aware of what the technical details are, but what are the impact of their work, and this has to start ground up. Not after they get the job and build their algorithms, which might have challenges ethically or societally. So, so part of these discussions as a research community have been important and across the board. And one of the other areas that I'm interested in is building this notion of cooperative AI and differential progress. There was a recent paper in Nature that discusses this, and I think I put the link. And what are some of the important characteristics of cooperative AI? We want systems that have the ability to understand the consequences of their actions, both on other agents and in the human society at large. and all the consequences on the environment. We also want agents to be communicating with each other, cooperating, and commitment. So these are, I see these as almost like research facets. How do we do this better? How do we build algorithms which are transparent, unbiased, and are able to be accountable to follow each of these research goals? We also want agents to be able to identify norms and to follow what are the social norms that are out there. So again, when you're put in different societies or different groups, how does the agent identify what norms are? And some of our past work, my group's past work has been identifying this type of network that one is in and doing fast convergence. How do we come up with algorithms? So even within social networks, right? Social network is an example, and then we could have random networks, we could have scale, other types of, so social network is a scale-free network. How do we come up with convergence when networks have different characteristics? So first identify the type of network, and then have an understanding of identifying what the norms for that society would be, and achieving that norm. And finally, integrating this notion of network thinking has been, in at least the past decade, an important part of my work. So how do we, the agents, again, it's not too different from what multi-agent systems are. You just don't think about yourself, but also think about the society at large. Most of my work has been about other agents, but then, slowly also integrating the preferences of humans, while there are others who are doing work from the other end. Like, how do we look at agents and humans and then move forward with our solution process? So Bostrom, and this is part of the Cooperative AI Foundation, has written a lot on these ideas of differential progress. And this is the notion where you want to accelerate, and I think this would cross-cut any of the technologies we're talking about today. How do we accelerate the implementation of beneficial technologies, especially those that would reduce the hazards posed by other technologies? So we can't be, again, working in a silo or in our own narrow box. As other technologies advance, how do we talk to each other? And I think conferences like this are very helpful in understanding the impact of our work. So in conclusion, happily, AI has made tremendous progress in the past decade or more. And I think there's, now instead of just moving from games, so initially when I was doing my graduate school, we were looking at machine learning. It was mostly just games, and then it was a game called AlphaGo, which put us on the radar of industry, where this system called AlphaGo beat the best Go player in the world, Lee Sedol, and in a very different fashion from the chess game that was played in 1997 against Kasparov. So the difference was with Kasparov, when Kasparov was beaten, it was more a complete search, whereas here, the system in AlphaGo was able to self-learn and come up with algorithms that no human had even thought about. It's moves that looked really bad to the experts, and eventually it beat the experts. So we are definitely making progress, and games are just an abstraction of what we can do in real-world situations. You can take that and apply it in traffic. You can apply it for, like farming and agriculture. How do you get to optimize your resources and get the best results, outcomes that you would like? But it is critical to consider downsides. I put a more positive, radiology often gets beat up at AI conferences because vision has gotten so, vision research has gotten so good that often the discussion is, oh, radiologists are going to be replaced by AI. But here's a quote, which I completely agree with. I think humans are important in the loop. We are not replacing the human in the loop. But definitely AI won't replace radiologists, but radiologists who use AI will probably replace the radiologists who don't. So it's not just for radiology, but in general, I think AI is an assistive technology which we should leverage so that we can, as humans, be able to focus on the more complex problems, and AI is able to do the things which might be easier in some sense, but computationally intense as well. So hopefully humans would be freed to do things which are more interesting and more complex as a result of AI. So that is the goal. That is what I hope to train my students to do instead of replacing jobs. So that's always a concern one has to be aware of. And there is the role of government. It's important that government recognize the importance of AI, give it the freedom to do the work where it's needed, but also set limitations when things are going wary, right? So so they need, I think the government has to keep people informed about what is going on in the research, and that is when you fund the researchers give the reports and that information. And I think it's already happening. Our reports are becoming more detailed, be very detailed of how this is going to affect society. But I also think that researchers should identify what the potential bad effects are of their work, so at least give it thought, even when we are publishing papers. So what are not just the limitations, but how can this, what could go awry, and what do you need to do about it? We couldn't cover the whole space, but at least we start thinking about these issues. And finally, I think there's a role of the AI community to share data. This is always a challenging issue, even more so within health, but that's where we need data. 10,000 patients with 3,000 features for every visit sounds a lot, but that's not enough for the kind of work that we are doing. We actually need 5 times more, and the right type of data that would help us with our learning process. Also, I think the community has to avoid hype. Unfortunately, our field does go through these cycles of too much hype, and it might be from the outside. So researchers need to be very specific about what the results are, what the challenges are, and they need to connect to the users. And finally, I think the goal of our research should be to empower people and not to devalue humans. So that if that is clear and that's why we are moving forward, I think there's continued great excitement for the AI community. So thank you for your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. So next up is Dr. Shawali Mohan, who is a senior member of the research staff and principal investigator at the Xerox PARC organization in California. And she works also on AI with a special attention to human-machine collaboration.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very excited to be here. I'm Shiwali. I'm a member of research staff at Xerox PARC. Some old-timers may know it used to be a famous research lab. We still believe we are doing good things, but here I am. I titled my talk Humans of AI, and well, it's a tip of a hat to the famous collection of photographs called Humans of New York, and we are in New York, so I was excited to title my talk this, but also this is a critical introspective talk as an AI scientist. A lot of the times as AI scientists, we tend to get super excited about algorithms and systems and efficiency and models, but we forget where these systems are being designed for humans, and those humans would like to do something interesting with these systems, right? So I want to sort of turn our discussion over its head and think about humans of AI first, humans who are using AI systems to do something productive, and that's what I'll be talking about today. All right, like with any good AI talk, I'll start with some inspiration from Hollywood. So we've been fascinated over past century, fascinated with AI systems, right? We envision these societies where little robots and humans are living together doing good things. And what's exciting about these things, I think, is that these entities are intelligent collaborators. They are independent long-living entities. They are goal-driven, they solve problems, they interact and communicate with humans, empathize with them, and they learn from the experience, right? That's what makes them, these entities, very exciting. But if we look at AI research now, it doesn't look like what we thought AI would look like, right? If you are clued into the hype cycle of AI, we recently got to know about DALL-E 2, it's a trillion parameter model that can generate images that look like art, right? So the focus has been on larger models, larger data sets, and beating the state of art, and that sort of ends where that's the end of AI research. And this doesn't look like what we, Hollywood taught us AI should be. Right, so the question that my research and other system scientists and Anita is part of that community, they ask is, will algorithmic research by itself lead to intelligent collaborators that we were excited about? And the answer tends to be no. You actually have to put all of that algorithmic research, machine learning research in AI systems, and there are communities and people who are exploring that, right? So Anita showed you what an AI system would look like, the view, right? So AI system living in the world, it perceives the world, it represents the current state, it knows certain actions that it can do, it thinks about what's the right action given its goals, and it acts, right? So, and on it goes. It's trying to achieve certain goals in its environment. However, if you deploy this system, there is a critical part of this equation that's missing. There's almost always going to be a human involved in this loop somewhere, but the science doesn't know where to put the human in. Right, so we don't know how to put the human into this loop that the AI system is operating in. And this has been, like recently, people have been starting to bring this question up, right? So we have articles that are coming out that say that, we in AI science, we don't know how to represent humans, how to model them, how to interact with them. And this is where I think social sciences and AI science, computational sciences can interact, because social sciences have studied human behavior, human learning, human lives, and we can bring those models into AI to, develop better collaborative AI systems, right? So that's where a lot of this talk and my research will go in the direction of is how do we build intelligent collaborators that are designed to support the goals of a human partner. So we are starting from this goal that we want to support a human doing a task. We want to model the human partner explicitly. We want to understand how they will react to changes, how will they learn, how will they behave. And then we are really focused on figuring out AI systems that will have effective performance on human tasks. So we are trying to move away from computation-centric metrics of efficiency, largeness of the model, accuracy, to more metrics that focus on effectiveness in human tasks, right? So we want to look at safety in health applications. We want to look at acceptability in transportation. And I'll talk about those a little bit. But what this does is this opens up the space of applications that we can deploy AI in. And I'll talk about a few of these problems. So I wish I had a great, unified theory to give you, like, this is how you would include humans in AI systems or models of humans in AI systems, but I don't. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this case study style. So I'll present 3 different projects that I have worked on in the past, and we'll talk, in each of those projects, they're from different domains. We'll talk about what does it mean to model humans and bring theories of human behavior into AI reasoning, and then I'll conclude with some closing thoughts. All right, so the first topic is interactive task learning, and the context of this problem is so, right? So as if you are from Silicon Valley like I am, robots are going to be here, and they will live with us in our world, right? There's already robots running around in Mountain View delivering pizza to graduate students. So that's already exists, and now Amazon is releasing more robots that will follow us around in our homes, right? So robots are here. The problem is that it's really hard to program a robot. And everyone's home is different, and everyone really has set patterns that they want their people who live with them to follow, excuse me. Now, one way of deploying this is that every time a robot is put into someone's home, there's like a team of engineers that comes with that robot, and then they program that robot so that now it can do the things like it could make a chapati like your mom does, right? So, but that's just unscalable. There's not going to, this solution will just not work, right? So the other way to think about this question is that can we design robots that can be trained by the end users of those robots, right? So humans are natural teachers. We teach each other all the time. Whenever someone comes to our home, we teach them like, oh, this is how we have organized our kitchen. Can you please help us? right? So we want to leverage this natural capacity that humans have to teach robots and then have robots program themselves through these natural interactions. So that's where the problem of interactive task learning comes from. And in 2017, there was this meeting, a large interdisciplinary meeting with people from machine learning, cognitive architectures, robotics, psychology, computational linguistics. All these people got together and talked about this problem of interactive task learning. How do we design agents that learn from and teach humans while they live with them? And so it's a great book that came out of that effort, and I would encourage you to read it if this is something interesting, right? So interactive task learning is a very different paradigm. If you think about machine learning and how machine learning systems are taught, these are, you give them an input, there's a data set which has the input signal and then the supervised signal that goes with it, right? That's how those systems are trained. But that's not how humans think about teaching or training. And here's an example of what
Put it on your head.
humans do.
Ooh, good try. Try again. On your head, on your head. Put it on your head. Go ahead. Ooh, good try again. Good try, but you're missing your head. You gotta put it here on your head. You wanna try again? You need help? Help? Okay, I can help.
Okay, so this is what natural interactive task learning is, right? So that was my friend's son Ishan, and he's talking to his nanny Sitsi, and they're trying to, basically Sitsi is trying to teach Ishan how to put a how to wear a hat. And you will note, and this is not surprising, but there is no training phase, testing phase, training phase, testing phase. It's all incremental. There's experience that Ishan is now analyzing and then extracting useful information from so that he would be able to do the task, right? It's all online. Classical machine learning setup would okay, let's take the architecture offline, retrain it, bring it back online, and now it performs certain. That's not how humans learn or behave. And I think one of the most interesting things is this notion that Ishan knew when he had failed at the task, right? He failed to orient the cap properly. He knew it, and he asked for help. And that's very critical because learners know where they're failing and why they're failing. And human teachers can really flexibly adapt to that situation once you realize that the person that you're working with does not know this component of the task. You will really hyper-focus on that, right? So that nature of human learning, the active nature, the interactive nature is critical, and that's why we learn so efficiently, right? We learn from small, few experiences, but these experiences are highly salient for that task. And then the final critical part about human learning is this benevolent teacher, right? The nanny who wanted to teach Sitsi tasks. So we want to incorporate all of these notions that are part of human training into designing robots, right? So the kinds of approaches I work with, I'm most excited about an approach that's built off of cognitive architectures. So you've learned of deep learning architectures. They are not this architecture. These are different class of architectures. You could think of them as blueprints for generally intelligent behavior, right? So it's an intersection of cognitive science and artificial intelligence. The research has looked at what is the computational basis for generally intelligent behavior in humans, because they are the only known examples of generally intelligent behavior, right? And then can we extract something useful from them and then implement algorithms and software that operate like humans, right? So that's where the philosophy of the design is basically comes from. And they've been in development for 40 years, so there have been progress. There's built systems, architectures that do that. The prominent one that I work with is called SOAR. And so it's currently hosted at University of Michigan. That's where I went for grad school. And we've been working on this interactive task learning problem since 2012, right? So this is year 10 of trying to build systems that can be trained by humans through natural interaction. And the most recent advancement was that we won the best, the work at Michigan won the best demonstration award at AAAI. So this was an agent called Rosie that could be trained to do certain kitchen tasks by a human through natural interactions. I'm going to talk a little bit about two recent advances that we've made that we've done at PARC. So the first one was, before we design an agent that can learn from natural human teaching, it's very useful to understand how do humans teach and why does that matter, right? So machine learning and a lot of AI people would have us believe that humans are only good for giving us labeled data, But that's not true. Humans don't think like that. Humans don't teach like that, right? So we wanted to unpack what human teaching is. And so here's Preeti, who's a graduate student at University of Michigan. She basically constructed this study in which she had people come in and play around in this blocks world on the top right corner and use these blocks to build a wall, right? And then we analyzed this data and tried to extract some general principles of human teaching. So and then they were, so there's some findings, right? So the first one is that people naturally break down complex tasks into simpler components, right? So in the task of building a wall, people naturally broke down, okay, these are red objects, these are green objects, you have to place them next to each other, right? So they broke down a very complex task, which was sequencing, putting these objects in a sequence into simpler components that now the robot can potentially reason with in a very limited, hypothesis space. People use and express a variety of teaching intentions. So it's not just, people are not just giving data to the robot, but they're also trying to evaluate the boundaries of competence of the robot. So they will ask, okay, now can you place the red object next to the blue object, just to evaluate if the robot actually knows the concept next to. People are flexible and they react to failures in the robot, right? So that's a good thing. That means that as we expose the failures of robot to the human teachers, they would react to it and would give the robot the right information. And then finally, people organize these concepts into very distinct, what we call curricula. And these curricula were flexible, were adaptive, and then they were influenced by how people, people's background. So it's a very cool paper. I encourage you to read it. So as now we know how humans teach, we are now also making progress on building architectures that can learn from that kind of teaching. So the architecture is called Eileen, that can demonstrate human-like learning. And it basically learns in a way that humans do, right? So it's an interactive learning loop where there's a teacher who's interacting with the agent using, a situated environment where, the teacher is, again, trying to teach the robot how to play with the blocks world. And this, the AI learning, as Anita said, that, it has several machine learning, logical inference, planning components all put together into a system. So these are not independent algorithms that usually, when AI people talk about, they talk about those algorithms, but they're put together in a system that has interesting behavior, right? And what we are seeing is that now we have architectures that do multi-level reasoning. So at the bottommost level, we have inference methods that are reasoning with the metric space that a robot has to deal with, right? The real world, the real perceptions, the robotic control, and all of that. But then a level up, there's a level of reasoning that reasons about tasks and goals, and this is like becoming more human-like, where it's thinking about, okay, what is the final goal I want to achieve? How do I get there? And at the topmost level, it is reasoning about concepts in general, right? The knowledge that it has, general knowledge it has about the world. So we are now beginning to sort of lay the foundations of an architecture that can reason at multiple levels, just like humans do. And we found that this architecture learns in a way that very similar to how humans learn, right? So it can learn various types of concepts. It can ground natural language onto those concepts. It learns very quickly, generalizes rapidly, because the trainer can give it salient examples. And then, like humans, it's very opportunistic in its learning. It can figure out where it fails, ask for an answer, and then learn from that. And so what I wanted to highlight is that as I come to the close of this particular case study, is that design of AI systems is not just algorithms and data, right? It's also cognitive science, because we are designing these systems to work with humans, so we need to understand what those humans are doing. And with the structural guidance from cognitive science and psychology, we are able to define the desiderata for AI system design, and then implement those algorithms, right? So it's an interdisciplinary pursuit. All right, so several others of my colleagues are doing wonderful, fascinating work on human-robot interaction and collaboration, all of which is focused on trying to build robots into human spaces and make them safe to live with humans, right? So it's a great field. There's a conference that's a yearly conference called a Human-Robot Interaction. So if there's any interest, you could go look up those papers. All right, so switching gears a little bit, I'll talk about sustainable transportation. So a lot of you live in New York. I come from California, so this scene is very common, where all the highways are choked up, and Anita already talked about how AI can help solve that problem, right? Congestion wastes several billion hours of time and several billion gallons of fuel per year. So ARPA-E Transnet back in 2013 came up with this program where they said, hey, can we use technology to help solve this problem, right? And we can come up with energy efficient routes for everybody who's in the transportation network. But there's a critical part missing, right? So you can come up with the most energy efficient plan and you can tell it to the human. If the human doesn't accept that as the recommendation to follow, you have done nothing, right? So there's a critical human component to this problem where you have to influence the human to do what the system thinks is the best thing to do. So that's what we studied as part of the paper here in JER, is what does it mean to influence a human to follow a route that an energy efficient planning system is recommending. So we define this problem we call the influence problem. We imagine there's Dr. Jane, who goes to her office every day in the morning at 9 a.m. And she has a assistant installed on her phone that has access to her calendar, that has access to the transportation network that Dr. Jane is embedded in, and it knows that she can drive, she can walk, and she can take this specific bus. And it also knows some personal aspects of Dr. Jane, right? So it knows that she's employed in a regular job, she cares about her environment, values her free time while she travels, right? So using all of this information, Copter, which is the agent that we built, can in a timely fashion at 8:45 a.m. come up with an acceptable option that, hey, if you walk to this bus stop near your home, there's a direct bus to your office and that's what you should take. And it makes this message compelling by saying that by accepting this route, you would reduce emissions by 10%. You would contribute to reduction in emissions, right? So there's different aspects for influencing humans, and the paper lays out the mathematical framework of how we can do that so that AI computations can process that model and then personalize the recommendations to Dr. Jane so that those recommendations are actually adopted by Dr. Jane, right? So some of us may be familiar with this theory from behavioral economics, choice theory, which projects the choices or the route recommendations that you may have for Dr. Jane into her personal utility space, right? And when I'm saying, hey, you shouldn't drive, but you should take the bus, I'm asking her to pay a cost in terms of that utility. And the probability that Dr. Jane is going to accept that recommendation or adopt that recommendation is going to be inversely proportional to the cost. So if the cost of transitioning to bus is lower than transitioning to biking to her office, then she's more likely to go to the bus, right? So that's the main idea. And once we define the influence problem that way, we define acceptability that way, we can bring those notions of human modeling into AI planning, and we can say that instead of planning for the most energy optimal route, we are trying to figure out routes that lead us to maximal expected energy savings, right? So instead of going from actual expected to the most optimal energy optimization, we go to expected energy optimization. So few interesting findings. First was that we were able to build a machine learning model that was able to estimate acceptability of a mode using a large data set, and this model can predicts with diverse feature sets and can capture complex nonlinear relationships. We found that acceptability does influence adoption, so we validated it through a choice experiment with participants from Los Angeles, and we found that if we set up the system the way we did, people would actually reduce their driving and move to more sustainable modes of transport. And then we built an agent-based model to a simulation of Los Angeles transportation network and simulated agents or humans in that model to see if humans were behaving like our model said they would it even lead to energy savings? And we found positive signal there, so that would lead to some significant reduction in fuel and delay. Right, so that's positive news. We weren't able to really deploy this model, but I think we have set up the right set of evidence to show how models from behavioral economics can be combined with AI planning, and together they can solve this complex problem. All right, so very quickly, I'm going to just go through the final case study that we had. This was an NSF NIH funded project, and the premise was that behaviors rooted in sedentary lifestyles impose major healthcare costs, right? So these would be people not exercising enough, not eating well enough, and that lead to severe health problems that puts more cost into the healthcare system. So the project was focused on like how can we design technology that can support people in disrupting non-healthy behaviors and building healthier behaviors. And one of the most impactful ways of doing this is through human-to-human coaching, where a coach sits with a trainee and helps them, figure out what's working in their lives, what isn't, and what's the right way they can change some of their behavior so that they get healthier. Now, with the advance of mobile technology and artificial intelligence, there lays open the space of, well, can an AI coach that lives in your phone do similar things, right? And to design this AI coach, we really need to know what underlies human behavior and how that behavior changes, right? So it's a very cool problem for AI at CI in cognitive science, and that's why I'm super excited about it. So at PARC, we built two systems that are designed to solve parts of this problem. So NutriWalking is an exercise prescription algorithm. It's embodied in a mobile health coach that lives in your phone. And the goal of this system is to get people walking at the American Heart Association recommendation, right, which is 30 minutes of moderate intensity walking 5 days a week, right? But if someone who's super sedentary, you can't really ask them to walk at that level because first they might hurt themselves, second they will fail, and then third, they will never do it again because they hurt themselves and then they failed. So you have to put them on this ramp that slowly progresses them towards this goal. So our research looked at what would it mean for an AI system to build out this ramp and have people walk up this ramp slowly so that they're successfully able to get to that. Right, and again, it's the similar kind of an approach. We built a model of human behavior, of human walking, and how human aerobic capacity grows. And then we tied it together with our understanding our models of motivation. So what motivates people to pursue certain behaviors, how do they set goals and things like that. And then together, that was brought into an AI heuristic scheduling algorithm framework to then build an agent that could actually get people walking more. So there's several firsts with this kind of work. First this was an actual longitudinal ecological study of AI. So usually when you think of AI systems, they are very transactional, right? So you put in a search query, out comes a page. And usually that's how AI systems are projected at. But this was a long-term AI deployment. It worked over 6 weeks, right? So the AI actually had to have adaptive behavior for 6 weeks. Right? It was ecological in that people were not brought into labs to study the behavior of AI. People actually installed this coach on their mobile phone and lived their lives as they would, right? So we weren't changing anything about their life. We actually were trying to influence them as they were living their daily lifestyles. And we found that as we build these AI systems with human models, they're effective. Like people were able to build healthier behaviors. And what this research also made it super critical to me is that usually AI scientists think of evaluating AI in a very computation-centric manner, in which we look at efficiency, we look at accuracy, and we look at the speed of computation and things like that. But when you bring these AI algorithms into a context that's critical for humans, you have to revise how you will be measuring efficacy, right? So I was working with a physical therapist on this project, and I told her that this system is very highly accurate. And she said, I don't care about accuracy at all. I only care about safety of these systems because I don't get to see my patients if the system is deployed, which means that they're likelier to hurt themselves. So I don't care if you get them, walking more at the fastest speed. I want them to be safe, right? So that exposed to me that as we're building these systems, we have to rethink how we are evaluating what these systems are doing. And again, it's like follows a similar, philosophy, combining multiple different fields together with AI to build productive systems. All right, so just ending when we think of AI, or at least when AI scientists usually think of AI, we think of this deployment scenario, right? There's an AI system that's interacting with the world, and I delegate some tasks to AI, and then they get done, right? That's how typically AI is thought about. But actually, it's much more complex than that. There's going to be various different collaborative, interactive experiences with AI that humans are going to have. And unless we study humans, their behavior, their goals, and why to do certain things, we won't be able to study these really important ways of creating human AI pairs, and that will stop us from studying these really critical problems, right? So I talked about interactive task learning, I talked about sustainable transportation and health behavior change, but then the spectrum is very big, and almost any deployment of AI that you can think about, they're always going to be human or a set of humans involved, and we have to think about what they're doing and what their beliefs are, right? So some gratitude to all my colleagues and funders. And just, I'll end with some key takeaways. So modeling humans in AI systems is necessary for effective development. That's mostly just focused, inwardly focused. It's a mantra for AI scientists. The second thing that's maybe interesting to colleagues here is that social science frameworks and theories have really great starting points that can help AI system scientists develop better AI systems, right? The third thing is coming up with the right metrics and evaluation strategies for AI. So if you evaluate AI devoid of context, you will not solve the right problem. So we need to really focus on that. We need to build AI systems that learn and reason about humans like humans. And then I talked about 3 different problems, but there are several others that are similar. Thank you.
So, yeah, that was fascinating. So we're going to now have a talk. We're going to go back to the natural world and technology. And we will have our final talk by Dr. Gernot Wagner. And he is a professor now of finance at the Columbia Business School, but he has also served as the executive director of the Solar Geoengineering Research Program at Harvard, and he studies geoengineering and environmental and green tech.
Thank you. There we go. Okay, so my mission today is to convince you that anything and everything related to technology and society, technology and climate especially, is at the end of the day about moral hazard. Now, just full disclosure, once you have a hammer, everything feels like the exact same thing. So yes, there's a book where this came from, but more importantly, it is this interaction between, hey, there is this newfangled tech. Here's the Tesla AI guy. And then there is how we'd like to organize ourselves as society. This is Tesla AI guy going to Europe on vacation and finding that, wait, there are ways to organize ourselves that do not involve having a city with 600,000 people and the Bay Area with 20 million people around it, right, San Francisco Bay Area, and pretending that that has anything to do with how we should organize ourselves as society. Sorry, Shiwali and anyone else living in Silicon Valley, but, right, so maybe this is just me in my 3rd floor Lower Manhattan walk-up, making myself feel good about my life. But frankly, well, welcome to my Twitter feed, making fun of Bourbonites, Jerseyites, and anyone in between, about basically us knowing how to organize ourselves as society on the one hand, and on the other, looking out for technofix after technofix after technofix, trying to turn the climate ship around. Okay. Now, big picture, this is about climate. Emissions have been going up forever. Yes, COVID, no, didn't solve it. We also know the solution. Right? We basically have known about what needs to happen forever. Let's say 20, 30 years by now. Emissions have to come down eventually. That's the solution. And the big question, right, is what's the right mix? Technology, societal, behavioral changes, all these sorts of things. Well, this is the best week to talk about this of any, frankly. Monday, 3,000 pages, 2,913 pages. Yet again, IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, comes out and tells us why it is a problem, what do we need to do, where things currently are going. All right, so lots of detail in these. Squint at the red line. This is where things are going. Emissions over time. Look at the other ones. That's where we should be. No, graph after graph after graph, we are not anywhere close to where we need to be. Right? And yes, cue headlines like, we know what we need to do. It's the politics. And just to hammer home that point, yes, it's the politics. Of course, it always is. The left is the technical summary that the scientists give us. Right? There's the 3,000-page report. There's a 140-page summary provided by the scientists. And then, the past 2 weeks of this process, the IPCC process, to get political buy-in, every country on the planet has a line item veto power in this 2-week negotiation to come up with a summary for policymakers. For the most part, that means stuff just gets cut. Well, sometimes, often, frankly, it means fairly clear statements provided by the scientist. We've got to get rid of fossil fuel infrastructure. That's the short summary of the thing on the left. Gets converted into, oh, and by the way, we can add, here's the theme, a technofix. We don't actually have to get rid of the fossil fuel plant. We can add some carbon capture and storage. That's what the CCS stands for. On top, we can just suck it back out after. And up to a point, yeah, we can. The technology exists. But, just to hammer home the point with another headline, yeah, we are kind of running out of time. I mean, we've been running out of time for about 30 years, or, 1965, the very first blue ribbon panel putting a report on the desk of the US president saying, this is a problem, let's act. Right? And by the way, the science is sort of 19th century science. This is a couple of centuries ago at this point, right? More CO2, higher temperatures. And then, by the way, today is sort of an operative day, right? If you look at the summary here, emissions have to come down by 2025, high confidence. Today, April 7th, we have exactly 1,000 days left until January 1st, 2025, right? Now, okay, false precision, these deadlines, of course, are, yes, they are partly political, even though it is a scientific statement, but still. Okay, so the urgency is clear. Let's start with that. Now, sometimes these reports do give us new information, and, in this case, it's maybe not new information so much as the new graph, the new killer graph, the thing that we'll see over and over again, anyone in the climate world for the next years, several years. There's a whole bunch of different technologies on the left. And when you squint at these colors here, the blue stuff pays for itself. So let's zoom in a little bit. Yes, it's wind. Yes, it's solar. Of course, it's always been. There's a bit of nuclear. There's some other things like reducing methane emissions and so on and so forth. But the solution is sort of staring us in the face. Right? It's a massive deployment of, in this case, existing technologies, yes. And to go back to the theme of Tesla AI guy goes on European vacation, yeah, electric vehicles will make a difference, of course. Right? The Bourbonites stuck driving will want an electric vehicle, or we would want them to use an electric vehicle. And yes, that pays for itself. So do hybrids. Of course they do. But of course, well, said Bourbonite is still stuck in traffic. Right? So, yeah, shifting to bikes and e-bikes pays for itself. Of course it does. It's also a techno-fix of sorts. Right? Moving into smaller apartments in cities is also a techno-fix. Now, more than that, right? It's a shift in attitude. It's all, it's many more things. It's building new homes in cities as sort of the ultimate techno-fix in all of this, right? NoHo Soho rezoning, to put a very New York-specific spin on things. But it's absolutely clear that plan A is to cut CO2 emissions. Or perhaps more to the point, it's to cut CO2 emissions and methane and other greenhouse gases. And frankly, that verdict has been with us forever. Okay. Starting in sort of the 2000s, we basically figured out that, look, we're not going to do this soon enough. There is so much hurt already built in that we definitely have to adapt, resiliency, become resilient to the global average warming already baked into the equation. Right? New York City has already moved from the temperate zone into the subtropical zone a couple of years ago. That has already happened. We are not going to stop climate change here. We know we already have to adapt. And by the way, the theme of sort of the moral hazard, right? There's a bit of this going on here already. Or more to the point, Al Gore was on the record in the mid-1990s in saying, let's not talk about adaptation quite yet. Let's solve climate change first, cutting emissions. And yeah, then let's talk about it. Now, okay, fast forward a decade. Right? Al Gore himself, of course, and frankly, every environmental group on the planet has realized that actually talking about adaptation might actually push us to want to do more on the emissions front as well. It's not moral hazard so much as maybe it's inverse. Right? Sort of the frying pan effect. You whack someone over the head with this, hey, this is happening. We have to adapt. Maybe we wake up to do more of the former as a result. Meanwhile, plan A also involves something else, sucking it back out. That's a techno-fix that goes well beyond wind turbines and solar panels, cutting CO2 emissions, right, moving to the city and so on and so forth. Lots of other things here. And frankly, that too we have known for quite a while. Here's 2009, over a decade ago by now, well over a decade by now. These are a dozen climate models, climate economy models, asked to limit temperature increases, concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere linked to temperature increases to 2 degrees centigrade above global average, warming, above pre-industrial temperatures. That's what this right set of columns is, these 450 parts per million of CO2, for those in the know. Well, look at the outcome. Decade ago, over a decade ago, it was basically impossible, with some frankly fairly heroic assumptions, to limit global average temperatures to the sort of temperatures we thought are necessary to have a livable planet. We still think over a decade ago, that was basically gone. Now, a lot has happened in that decade, namely technology. Emissions is still going up, but frankly, rapid deployment of solar and wind, low carbon technologies, massive cost decreases. 40 years ago, when Jimmy Carter put a solar panel in the White House, and Ronald Reagan took it down 5 years later, a solar panel cost 100 times as much as it does today. 10 years ago, cost 10 times as much as it does today. Nobody is taking down solar panels from any roofs anymore. We are deploying them rapidly. Costs have come down, capacity has gone up, electricity generated has gone up massively. As a result, things don't look quite as bad anymore in the sense of OMG, catastrophe. But frankly, we are far from where most scientists did say, Monday this week, we ought to be. So in other words, Plan A does in fact include a fourth element here. Right, and now we can talk about inequality and the rich adapting, the poor suffering, and so on. The usual story applies, of course, but it is certainly clear that by now we more or less know that suffering is built in. And we've known that for years at this point as well. At the same time, it is clear that there is no plan B. And when I say this definitively, I can point to a couple fellow economists here in shame, in the sense of, you introduced me by saying I used to work on solar engineering. I still do, very much so. When people who are not necessarily initiated in the finer details of this particular technological intervention first hear about solar geoengineering, and I will spend a couple minutes talking about what it actually is, their first reaction is very much like the Tesla AI guy with electric vehicles. Here's a technofix. Here's the thing that will prevent us from having to do anything else. In this case, of course, much more dramatic, right? Don't have to cut emissions, don't have to adapt, don't have to suck it back out. We'll just build this artificial sun shield for the planet. It'll cool the entire planet. Everything will be fine. And, no surprise, the usual suspects, I highlight Mr. Newt Gingrich here on the right, would pick up on that. And for example, in his case, literally at the time, 10 or so years ago, when under President Obama, we had our last go at trying to pass sensible climate legislation in this country, he writes an op-ed saying, found solution to climate change. No need to vote for this thing after all. You can solve climate without actually cutting CO2 emissions. Now, there's a couple interesting things happening here. In order to be able to say this, you actually have to acknowledge that the problem exists, which is actually a good step in the right direction, if you will. But of course, then talking about this as if it were a plan B, you might as well deny that the problem exists, right? The outcome is the same. You're still voting no on the legislation. Oh, in other words, yes, I do think we should look into this particular technology too. We should do the research, solar geoengineering. But no, it is no plan B. It's plan A plus another technology added to the suite of potential technologies. Okay, so just very quickly, what am I even talking about? It is literally building an artificial sun shield for the planet. It's basically doing what volcanoes have been doing forever, So when Mount Pinatubo erupts in the Philippines in 1991, global average temperatures in 1992, ironically just at the time of the Rio Earth Summit, June 92, are half a degree centigrade, almost 1 degree Fahrenheit, cooler than they would have been without the volcanic eruption. Emissions didn't go down. Nothing else happened. Global average temperatures decreased. Didn't solve climate change, just to be clear. Oceans are still acidifying, lots of other problems. Still way too much CO2 in the atmosphere. Didn't address the root cause. But if temperatures are one of the key metrics here, well, here is a technology. And when I say here's a technology, no, let's not explode volcanoes willy-nilly, but maybe let's do the research to figure out whether it might be possible to deliberately introduce aerosols, tiny reflective particles, into the lower stratosphere with exactly this in mind. Okay, so how to think about this? Here's a very complex graph. I won't tell you what the time scale is. I won't tell you what climate risks are. But the one thing we know is it doesn't matter what the time is. It doesn't matter how we measure risks. If we burn fossil fuels, those risks will continue to rise. No doubt. Here's another definitive statement. If we cut emissions to zero, the sort of thing we know we need to do. Well, let's assume we get around to it. Let's assume we actually do it. In any time scale relevant to humans, society, decades out, the climate risks, most of them we care about, will stop getting worse. They will. And frankly, that's the point. That's why we have to cut emissions to zero. They're not getting better. And by the way, when I say climate risks, it's largely climate risks associated, linked to temperatures, for example. Sea level will rise for centuries after. Yes, temperatures will stop increasing. Yes, that's a good thing. Yes, we have to cut CO2 emissions to zero on net. But climate risk isn't going to decrease, not in our lifetimes. So yeah, we have to suck it back out. It's the only way to actually decrease. Well, where does solar geoengineering come in? Taking the edge off. There is plenty of hurt built in here. There are plenty of people dying, literally, because of unmitigated climate change. And even if we do everything right, and newsflash, we won't. But even if we did, there would still be plenty of hurt built in where solar geoengineering might, that's the research question, actually make a real difference. Okay, a couple more points. Yes, there are trade-offs. There really are. And when I say hard trade-offs, when one contemplates, does solar geoengineering, and in this case, highly theoretical in a big way, let's do it to an extent where we stop temperatures from increasing. Well, we turn off carbon cycle feedbacks, for example, emitting more CO2 naturally because temperatures are rising. So actually, even just looking at CO2 impact, CO2 burden, if that's the only thing we cared about, solar geoengineering itself might still do a lot of good on net. And now we have a hard trade-off, right? Not that anyone is out there actually optimizing this in the real world, but if one were to, or if we do in our models, yes, there is a trade-off between spending the money to cut CO2 emissions versus doing that other newfangled tech, which of course has its own problems. But then, back to the main theme, there is moral hazard. There's Newt Gingrich. There is my fellow super freakonomics economists, and so on and so forth, who will basically look at this technology and say, if we have this tech available, we will get away not doing the hard stuff, not tackling the sort of things that we actually know need to happen. So yes, there are trade-offs. Now, not to put too much of a finer point on this, but debatable whether this is even moral hazard in the technical sense, or whether it's closer to a lack of self-control. Essentially, right, it's us deciding. Now the big question is who decides, and so on and so forth. But still, at the very least, yes, there are in fact these trade-offs. Okay, now, does it exist empirically? When we go out there and ask people, do they think that the availability of solar geoengineering will in fact detract from the need to cut emissions in the first place? Turns out there are about 30 or so studies out there that ask just that question. And frankly, the broad conclusion is that nobody knows what this technology is. So they'll tell you anything you want, basically. And actually, that is probably one of the most important conclusions in all of this. We went out, did one of these surveys. We asked the question 2 ways. Will it detract from, or will it lead toward you wanting to do more? Depends on how you ask the question. People just agree with you, because why not? Right? You're a smart scientist asking them. Must be a reason why you formulate the question a certain way. Right? The technical description of this is acquiescence bias. Yes, it's a thing. Yes, solar geoengineering moral hazard is a thing. But opinions are so malleable that you can basically get any question you want. Okay, now, there's a better way of doing this, turns out. We don't just ask a silly question, we observe people. In this case, full disclosure, by now a co-author of mine, but this study was absolutely her own, Christine Merck et al. Here. 600 Germans, 200 of them are told about solar geoengineering in a lab. They're also given money because they have to show up in this lab, or in this case, an online survey. And now they can do with their own money as they please, including offset their own emissions. Hey, wouldn't you want to spend some of your money to offset your emissions? Look, you're part of the problem. Well, it turns out people who are told about solar geoengineering, the 200 Germans in this case, but still people, are more likely to offset more of their emissions because they've been told about this new technology. Or in other words, the exact inverse of what moral hazard would lead us to believe. Right? So if basically technology, nuclear technology, geoengineering, doesn't matter what technology, is always about sort of technology versus behavior. Well, actually, maybe there's a way to talk about this new technology. And in that case, it doesn't matter which technology. Yes, geoengineering is one example, but maybe nuclear as well. Or maybe any technofix. Where it is not about, oh, technology might bail us out, absolve us of the need to do the hard stuff, but actually remind us that, hey, this is a real problem. Maybe we actually have to do more than we thought we did. And without being too all-encompassing here, it's sort of the burden of economists, right? We have a hammer and then we apply it to everything. I'd like to think that applies much, much more broadly, in the sense that whether it's SynBio or GMOs or AI or, yes, any sort of climate technology, from nuclear on the one hand, or anything that's not quite as kosher to environmentalists as wind and solar on one end of the spectrum, or solar geoengineering on the other. Unless we find a way to have the sort of conversation about new technology that leads to yes and, we are doing something wrong here, right? We are not going to stop conversation, research into development of any of these technologies. If they are cheap, if they work, if the risks are socialized and the benefits are internalized, the usual story, those technologies will come. Yes, they will. They're not going to solve every societal problem, and yes, they have to be channeled in the right direction, and yes, it takes government, and yes, it takes lots and lots of other things to channel these individual wishes and wants and desires into the right direction. But it is incumbent upon us, as those working on the technology, talking about the technology, trying to frame the technology, trying to figure out how to channel it in the right direction more broadly, back to our Tesla AI guy, to try to get to this inverse moral hazard, as opposed to being stuck in this infinity loop of any new technology will always be met with resistance at first because of course, moral hazards dominate. Thank you.
So we've had, a talk on bioengineering, environmental and green tech, AI and automation. And what do the panelists think are some of the sort of cross-disciplinary themes that have emerged from these discussions? And do any of the panelists have any curiosities about any of the other presentations? And do you think that they speak to one another in any ways? I guess I will open the floor that way. Oh, that's right. Okay. So everyone has their personal mic. So yeah, so anyone can jump in.
Oh, I have a question for Pam. So you said that you were, so I don't know enough about GMOs to be angry or excited about it, but you said that you were excited. So could you help us understand both sides of the debate and then why you are on the excited side?
Well, that's a big question to understand both sides of the debate. And I'm probably not the world's expert, but I will just say some things. So first of all, I think the first question is, what is a GMO? And that definition actually depends on what country you're in. So it makes it even added complexity. In general, it refers to the introduction of foreign DNA into an organism. And let me say that I think you probably know the answer to this, some fraction of the crops in California are GMOs. I think there's corn and soybean. So we are using GMOs. Now, I may go off on a tangent here. There is a potential revolution that could happen in this space. I'm sure you've all heard the words CRISPR. But what CRISPR allows you to do, in principle, is alter the genome without introducing foreign DNA. And that is one of the potential upsides, because in principle, that would not be a GMO. And in fact, I think it's in China, they have declared that CRISPR-engineered crops are non-GMO. So that could be a game changer. So back to, so wanted to get the definition out there. Why, and then the question is, why is it, what's the danger? And again, there's many answers to that question. The simplest answer is that you are putting something non-natural, not made by nature, into the environment, and it will have some adverse effect. So the difference between GMO and medicine is release into the environment. At least that's my take on it. And so that carries a lot of weight. The political side of GMO release and attitudes about that are much more complex and originate actually in Europe in the, I believe when Monsanto first introduced the resistant, whatever it was, in Europe, and most of that was politicized, it was political. And the history, and this brought on the history of the organic food movement. But it's been with us now. So the scientific resistance, which could also be in part the emotional resistance or real, is that this could have some kind of bad effect on me or on the environment or on things in the environment. It might kill the monarch butterflies or something like that. Okay, now the biological risks are impacts on endogenous species, and the one that I am most intrigued by, and potentially this is the one that actually underlies the concern, is potential for horizontal gene transfer. And most people don't even know what that means. And that's okay. There's a great movie, oh God, I'm gonna block on it. There's science, it's embodied in a lot of science fiction movies. And that's the actual inherent scientific thing that people are worried about. Now that applies to corn that is bred at Monsanto also, even though it doesn't have foreign DNA in it. And if you want to see an amazing, it's not Monsanto anymore, by the way, isn't it? It's Bayer, I think. But visiting there and watching how they do plant engineering is a sight to behold. They have this thing called the corn chipper. And so they take thousands of seeds, millions of them, and they run them through a machine that takes a picture of the seed and knows what the perfect seed should look like. And when it sees that one, it chips it off a piece and sequences its genome. So the corn breeding has become an amazing state of the art. And so you could say those are person-bred organisms being introduced into the environment. So we've been doing that for millions of years. Okay, so why am I not worried? First of all, I think that there's an enormous awareness of potential dangers, and there are solutions. Secondly, it's a question of risk versus reward, which is something that it permeates all technology and has been an underpinning of recombinant DNA since day one. I was not very old, but the person I worked for at Harvard was one of the star witnesses in the recombinant DNA case before the Cambridge City Council. And if you want to watch an amazing piece of interaction between normal people and scientists, I recommend, even though they're kind of grainy, you should watch that. Because the question is, what is the definition of risk? And I think vaccines capture the risk versus reward. And personally, I think feeding the planet captures risk versus reward. I think capturing more carbon is a good thing to do if it requires engineering organisms and plants. So for me personally, it's about reward. I could go on forever, but I won't.
Any follow-up question. I mean, I think that's one of the sort of master themes here, as well as, yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Maybe just to put sort of another spin on this, whether it's GMOs and bio, AI up to a point, although I know very little about the actual implications there, solar geoengineering. Our usual shtick as economists, as policy analysts, is a benefit-cost analysis. And frankly, most of these technologies, solar geoengineering is sort of vaccine territory in terms of benefits to costs. It's 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 to 1, the benefit-cost ratio. Right? Net benefits, based on what we know, are so large that, frankly, to me, economist is just the wrong decision criterion. It's not how you can look at this and then say, oh, yes, it's a good idea to do. It is all about, building your point, about risk trade-offs. It is all about not just risk-reward in the sense, oh, there are these unknown risks, let's compare them to the known benefits, but it's basically the risks of unmitigated climate change compared to the very real risks of a technological intervention that attempts to do something about it. It's not about benefit costs, it's about comparing risks, comparing sort of Don Rumsfeldian, right, known unknowns, and yes, worrying about the unknown unknowns. And both unmitigated climate change in this case and solar geoengineering, yes, have both of them. That's where the research needs to be. That's where the public policy ought to focus.
So to follow up, the question I had was about incentives with the German study that you talked about, Rad. So can you just put that in the context of, so why did they make the decision, so there's a study population, that they are going to accept that there isn't a plan B? Is that what was concluded? I just want to make sure.
Okay, so this very specific, so the question is solar geoengineering the sort of technology that when you tell people, they will say, ha, solution to climate change found, don't need to worry about anything else. And in this case, it was the exact opposite. Okay, why? That's your question. And actually, that's my current research with Christina America on trying to, but her hypothesis, there are three hypotheses. One is basically, this is just such a scary thing that you want to avoid it at basically all cost, right? So if a semi-serious scientist tells you that this thing exists or talks about it, you'll spend your own money in a, frankly, vain attempt to try to stop it, right? So it's sort of this effect of, oh my God, we got to stop this technology. The other one is the slightly more positive spin, or very much more positive spin. It's sort of this wake-up effect, right? I described it sort of the frying pan effect, right? You whack someone over the head with this. It's kind of like, look, I always knew climate was bad, but wait, if serious people are talking about this, maybe, there is really something to this. And that's sort of actually, this I think is the better interpretation, the more appropriate interpretations of the hypothesis that seems to hold up fairly well, which is essentially it's sort of the positive version of this, right? It's basically, hey, we haven't been able to tell people that climate change is bad based on anything we've tried over decades, right? Maybe this finally does it, which, just to be clear, is a little bit of a naive view, right? It's not like people haven't tried to shock people into action before, right? Movies exist that talk about New York disappearing under, miles of seawater or ice, right? Depending on your perspective. So it's not the first time somebody talks about this technology, clearly not. But frankly, public discourse on solar geoengineering, we've only had it for about a decade, 15 years or so. The technology has been around for decades, but there's been a long-standing taboo not to talk about it because of the moral hazard, because it might detract from the need to cut emissions. Okay, and by the way, very quickly, the third hypothesis is basically people just don't know what offsets are, right? They think they solve climate by planting a tree somewhere, and newsflash, you won't.
I'm going to go back to the engineering of biology, because I think there is not only a perceived, but indeed an inherent risk. And I want to make sure that people understand that there is a huge effort in the synthetic biology community to define, mitigate, and appreciate the risks. And this really goes hand in hand with the development of the technology. So, for example, we have developed solutions that should protect against runaway release in the environment. But I want to give one example that is happening right now that I think is interesting, and it is a product of climate change, and that is the release of engineered mosquitoes into different areas on the Earth to combat mosquito-borne diseases, dengue. So there's been massive releases in Brazil. There's going to be one in Florida. And this is fascinating technology. I'd be willing to bet a lot of people don't even understand it. But I want to just go back to, the 1950s or whenever, when, malaria is still a scourge to the earth, right? And imagine if we could cure that with engineered mosquitoes. Let's think back to what we did do about malaria, which was to use DDT, which, by the way, worked. India, huge. We just used it at too high a concentration. If they had actually used it at maybe 1/100th, I don't know, the concentration, things might not have gone so badly for nature. So, and at the same time had a positive effect. So now, DDT is forbidden for the most part. But so I'm thinking about this mosquito solution. And again, if that were to wipe out local mosquito-borne diseases, I think that would have a huge impact, and a lot of people would not be asking, so what was that mosquito anyway that they released? They would see the outcome. And so I just want to interject that because it's a modern day thing that's actually happening. There was another okay to do this, I think in Florida, which was amazing to me.
That's interesting, and it brings to mind, one of the common themes here seems to be sort of how does technology and how can it train human behavior or retrain human behavior? As you were saying, the prospect of solar geoengineering as a technological solution might actually make people believe that these problems are more tractable, right? And I was brought back to your presentation about training humans through artificial intelligence and intelligent agents. And what's interesting, there seems to be a sort of common theme there that human behavior, that technology can aid humans in retraining themselves, right, in some way. And I don't know, I was wondering if you could speak to that and making the world better for humanity in some way, right?
Right, that's a great connection. I missed that. So humans are incredibly adaptable and flexible. So any technology changes that happen, they would adapt to it. Like that's the nature of the species. My talk was mostly focused on designing systems so that we are supporting that behavior change in the positive direction, right? Because behaviors can shift in either directions. And we want, at least as an AI scientist, I try to be cognizant of what the eventual outcome is and what is it that we are building towards. With climate, I guess Gernot would say a little bit more about what he meant when he said, that's changing behavior.
Okay, so I think that the short version in
I guess I'd focus in on a point that doesn't really quite emerge much, but and that has to do with what you said, that humans will really be able to adapt and are willing to adapt. And I'm not, I'd really kind of challenge you on that, because I'm not so sure that that's the case, because there's lots of morals that involved that people will invoke, and whether we should or shouldn't. We see this, of course, in the medicine area about whether we should, sort of use. So I wouldn't quite go that way in terms of what people want out of technology, which is something that is, it might be available, but do you want it? And I think that's really something that, if you was dealing with AI, would be a really serious problem for me, because you'd have to actually, whatever machine you were doing, whatever AI we were going to do, you'd actually have to invoke some sorts of notions of morals and in what you were in the process of not only it deciding, but providing an answer that you expected some kind of return to in the human world. Which leads me to the other question that I would have, both for the AI and for you, for the automation, but I guess I would say for all of you, could you imagine within the technology field that yourself, anything that you would say, even if we said knowledge should always be there, that you would be reluctant to, that you yourself in the technology would be reluctant to go in?
I want to address your question, and I'll be somewhat brief here, but in the medical context, and give you a counterexample. This Alzheimer's drug that has come on the market, it doesn't work. And the FDA even almost showed it doesn't work. Yet, consumer demand, people want it. So what do you do with that? I mean, and in fact, it may even have negative effects on health. So there's a case where you have extreme, it's almost like climate change. There's no end to it. And yet people will do anything to get that drug. And then your second question, what was it? What would bad things? Yeah, I was just going to say. So the same thing, bad drugs. So what is a technology that can go astray? And that's one example of many, bad drugs, which get distributed globally. So that's my example.
Right, so I completely agree with you that the moral commitments that we make drive a lot of our behavior. And that's not where I was going with my answer and my presentation either. I think that's outside of the realm of AI and technology. That's more about human societies and how we function as organizations, right? That our morals are defined through our communities, through our experiences, through intellectual exchange with other people. And I don't see a big role of technology in that specific realm. But once you have decided that, I want to learn this new thing or want to develop this new behavior, that's where I see some of the work that I've done start playing a role, is to support that. On the second question that you said, the dangers of AI technology, I think it's already everywhere. So facial recognition tech, for example, that's highlighted, it's heavily talked about. The second thing would be, and this is more recent, is using machine learning AI methods on audio signals to infer a person's mental health status, right? And then, because again, these are operating like black box systems, we don't understand them well, we can't inspect them, we can't explain their behavior. The determinations that are being made, which will then lead to consequences for the person, will be tremendous. So that's where we need more focus, more insights on. And there are several examples like that in AI where more critical inquiry is needed.
So for a person in technology, I'm actually very skeptical about using technology myself. So I get it, coming to this question of should I use this technology and what are the moral issues, but also, how was that drug authorized? I remember reading it in the news and I'm like, this went through too fast. I mean, the whole process was weird in terms of the recommendation by the government. So it was FDA and so on, right? So I think, I do believe that our consumers, the users, are going to do come at it, hopefully doing the right homework, right? So when I build my system, and Shiwali, I want to bring this up, when we built the system for the recommendation of route recommendation in traffic, we assumed that, we hoped and assumed that there'll be a certain % of people who'll reject the route. And that's how, because if everyone takes the recommendation by our application, actually it doesn't optimize our utility function. So we are hoping that there will be these skeptics, and we have to account for that as we build our system, especially when it comes to like cooperative problem solving. And in other cases, maybe there are different ways to convince, again, looking at subgroups and what would be needed to convince them to use that app. For example, I used recently, I'm not a runner, but a year ago, I got this running app only because the New York Times, after all these years, I read this article, and it talked about, couch to 5K. I'm like, there's no way I'm going to do this at 40 plus years, but I took it up, and I can run. I'm not a great runner, but I can run for 45 minutes, and I'm like, okay, or more. And it took several months, but it was because of that incremental approach that they took, right? So I think people change over time, there can be different ways of getting the users to use it, and you don't have to expect that everyone will use your technology. I think that's where we go.
Thank you. There's a lot of different things that I could ask about, but I'll try to focus on the three particularly interesting things that came to my attention. One is when you talked about the BioLeaf, how is that being practically implemented for practical use? I'm not a scientist, so I'd like to know how that goes about. The second question that I have deals with the traffic situation of New York City. One of the solutions to the city of New York is to just penalize drivers from a certain point of entry into the city of New York, or just to make an increased cost. And I was wondering, in terms of your traffic studies, is there ways to address that? I mean, Robert Moses decided to do that by just building more roads, more roads, more roads, and that, as we found out, they just kept on increasing the amount of people that drove on roads, and that didn't really solve the problems. And we also, of course, have a problem on the Kronsbras Expressway. And the third thing deals with the climate change. You talked about geoengineering. It seems to me that that conversation, or that concept, doesn't require any, quote, cost associated in terms of an individual having to adopt or reduce or something. So it seems to me the Germans might have reacted in a sense that saying, well, wait a second, I don't really have to do too much. This seems to be a great, wonderful solution to everything, so I'll put a little bit of money to that, and that'll solve my problems. If that is the case, and you actually illustrated on your slide, what is geoengineering? What is its cost? And as opposed to introducing it down the graph as a way to reduce the carbon emissions after you've implemented, the other adaptability, reduce carbon, recapturing carbon, that kind of stuff, why isn't that, at least as a talking point, when a politician goes out and says, like Newt Gingrich, geoengineering solves everything? Why can't that just be whatever form it takes, implemented right at the top, and therefore avoid that discussion about having to reduce carbons and whatnot? And how do you get around that political point?
Okay, I guess we should take those in order.
Okay,
Dr.
well, mine's
Silver.
the easiest one. The Bionic leaf is actually a closed system. It's self-contained, so you can imagine it sitting in a box. And so I think the comparison to make is, for example, and I'll come back to the Bionic leaf, but let me make the comparison to, say, algae. So algae, biofuels, big deal for a while. The thing about algae is that it has to be in direct contact with sunlight. And so that requires huge surface areas. It's like agriculture, right? And this has been one of the limiting factors in terms of algal engineering for, say, biofuels. The bionic leaf does not have to be in direct contact with sunlight. It can get its energy or its electricity from anywhere. So the box can sit in your basement. You could have a windmill on the top of your house that is creating the electricity that will go into the bionic leaf, cause the water splitting reaction, and biomass will grow. So it is not, it's a self-contained system. That's one of the actually breakthroughs, is that you can have the electrodes in direct contact with the living system, but that system can live somewhere separate from the incoming energy source.
Let's say I'm living in Africa, for example. How does that work for those places? I'm sorry. How would that work in dealing with the problem of food shortages in those places of the world which don't have access? Is there a practical application to that? To solve
Don't
that
have
problem?
access to
food.
Right. So it's amazing you bring this up.
Would that work?
So there is I'm actually involved. I have some work in this space, and also there's a DARPA program, and there's even some startup companies, and it's called Food from Air. So remember, these bacteria they're not using sugar, which would be the normal. You'd have to grow sugar cane, give them sugar to grow to make food. Instead, they use air. They use CO2, hydrogen, and nitrogen. And so in principle, the bacteria could grow. You could use them directly for food, or you can have them produce food components. So this is a big deal right now. Ironically, if you read the 1970 NASA report, this same idea is in there. It just never was implemented. And so you've hit on what I think is one of the most exciting ideas here.
Don't know the specific policy that you were mentioning for transportation in New York, but I don't think there's only going to be a solution that's more just technology, right? So it's a policy problem, it's incentives, and technology would be part of that ecosystem. And there have been studies that that show that, when there's incentives or sort of artificial incentives are created. So there was a study out of MIT that demonstrated that if we are paying people to, say, take buses, as soon as we remove that incentive, the behavior goes back to normal, right? So they will just revert back to whatever their baseline preference was, whatever their baseline utility model was. And so that's where the technology part, or at least the studies that we did start making sense, is that there is an underlying utility that people are using to make those decision choices. And if we can really leverage that into our technology systems, then the systems and their route recommendations are aligned with how each individual thinks about their transportation, right? So that's where the technology starts playing a role, but I wouldn't believe that, that the technology I talked about specifically would by itself solve all the problems that exist, and it's going to be a collaborative policy, improving our transportation network, changing attitudes so that people do want to live in cities and want to take public transport. So it's a multi-pronged approach. Technology would be only a very small part of it.
Our next question.
Yeah. And let me just agree with this, right? So congestion charging in lower Manhattan, right? So, this is literally the one law we have in economics, right? We run around pretending that people are like atoms in a vacuum often, and we behave all like, there's particular laws. Not true, of course. The one law we have that holds all of them: price up, quantity demanded down, right? Works every single time, or at least a couple exceptions we know. CO2 isn't one of them. Congestion isn't one of them, right? So yes, the solution, if you will, for traffic in New York City is to make everyone personally pay for the negative effects onto others when they choose to drive in New York. That's where congestion charging comes in, and just, the fraught politics of it all. Yes, we're going to get it, but there is currently an environmental review run by the state that will coincidentally conclude right after the gubernatorial election. Why? Well, because it is a state issue for New York City to be allowed to have congestion charging. And if you're the governor of New York, yeah, you benefit 8 million New Yorkers, or in this case, only Manhattan, sadly, because it's just lower Manhattan. But of course, anyone who drives into the city, right, the 12 million in the suburbs of New York, would not like to pay, even though, right, overall, societal well-being increases for everybody. Those who then have to drive in a pinch will be more able to do so at a cost, right? And this is sort of the high cost of free parking, right? It's that. Now, okay, geoengineering, right? Maybe let me end on a medical analogy. And medical analogies abound here. It's sort of painkiller, chemotherapy, and so on. But it sort of drives home this point, I think, of technology versus behavior. So should we tell the 15-year-old who hasn't picked up smoking yet, hey, don't worry, go for it, because if you have stage 4 lung cancer, there is chemotherapy, we can fix you. Or, asked differently, should the 15-year-old pick up smoking because chemotherapy is available? The short answer, of course, is no. Right? Now, if you're the 75-year-old stage 4 cancer patient, chemotherapy is in some sense the only thing that is going to extend your life, help extend your life, right? Diet and exercise isn't gonna do it anymore, right? Coulda, should've, but at that stage, not going to help. Well, cutting CO2 emissions is like diet and exercise. Offsetting your emissions is like diet and exercise in this case. Solar geoengineering is like the technical intervention, the medicine, the surgery, the chemotherapy, the painkiller, that might allow you to exercise in the first place, because it is the painkiller that allows you to get up in the morning at all, right? So is geoengineering, solar geoengineering, sort of the first thing you should do? No. But of course, the real question is our planet currently closer to the 15-year-old who should be told to diet and exercise because that's good for you and will extend your life? Or is our planet closer to the 75-year-old cancer patient for whom this particular drug, this particular intervention might be the best hope at extending somebody's life, right? And yeah, I won't speculate where I think we are, but yes, let's look into solar geoengineering because frankly, it is pretty darn late in the game.
I had another question for Shawali. Going back to Dr. Jane, when you were talking about Dr. Jane, because I found your example so interesting. But I think you, if I heard correctly, you were trying to talk about how Dr. Jane might take the bus, right? And to be shown that there would be a lower cost of that. But I was just, as I was listening to, I was thinking, I mean, that it's so interesting, everything you were saying about bringing in the theme of programming humans, but it would be a very rational, you're assuming a kind of rationality on the part of Dr. Jane, which may or may not, work. So I was wondering when things seem to be emotional and not simply rational. I mean, if you can sort of count on rational choice considerations to be operative in the example you gave. And then I just wanted to say that I'm seeing a theme emerging from last night's Paul Krugman to a number of you today, and the sort of that technology is doing all these amazing and concerning, that balance I think is going to be a theme, but a related theme is that you don't lose the importance of the human the human balance also, like how human beings are responding seems to, like technology is not overriding that. So how do you make decisions? How do you, go in, I think Anita was talking about taking into account a variety of concerns in some of the examples you were talking about, about transparency, et cetera. So it's an interesting theme, and I just wanted to ask about, is there a rationalistic assumption here?
Right. So there is, I would agree to that. And the reason for that rationalistic assumption is that to bring any kind of theory into AI computations, it has to be mathematical. And the mathematical theories that exist leverage the rational thinking framework, right? So it's just an easy, natural fit. So that's a bias because of the nature of sciences. In the Dr. Jane example, we did try to broaden that perspective out. So the influence problem that we were discussing does include things like messages that may be compelling to different people, right? So if we know that Dr. Jane cares about the environment, we can influence her more.
Oh, it's 1:30. Okay.
Seems to be.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I was reacting to your push on that there has to be a more humanistic component involved. And we did think about it, right? So the compellingness, so the algorithm that I talked about was mostly concerned with what should we recommend to Dr. Jane, right? The humanistic component would come into how should we make that recommendation, right? Because it could be true that for someone who cares literally just about how much it costs, telling them that you would cut down your expenditure by this much by taking the bus would be the most compelling way to deliver that message. But for Dr. Jane, who cares more about the climate, the better way to frame that message is that you're contributing to reduction in emissions, right? So we did lay out a framework of how that could happen. Integrating those ideas into AI systems is more challenging because, again, these are not mathematical, but you're on the right track with that. I'll let Anita.
Just to add to that, I would say that there are models which take into account that the response can be different, right? So just a simple Markov decision process, which would take into account the uncertainty in the response of the user, and then take that as a sequential process. So because they have rejected it, then these are the possible actions that you can now take. So thinking about an action strategy, not just as a single schedule or a plan, but it's really a tree, and you are walking through this tree and finding the right outcome that is occurring and then adjusting to the current environment. And this can be true not just about human response, but also when the agent takes an action, the environment itself can respond differently. You think that this is what's going to happen, but that did not happen, so how do you deal with that contingency? So it has to be part of the systems that we build. So it's definitely something that we take into account.
Do you have an additional question, Martin? Okay.
It's for the people dealing with essentially automation and AI, but I guess about AI, let's assume that you have a problem that you want to have solved by a robot who has been programmed in a particular kind of way. So you're looking at the program, and so the outcome of the program is basically decision one and possibly decision two, given what is analyzed by decision one. But in the process of making the decision on decision one, it has to, and if we talked about the whole human population, which brings different realities to a problem that has to be decided, then the issue really is taking the median, if you're actually doing this. That is, you have these outliers, so you're taking the median, and you have to account for that. So even in decision one, you're going to use the median, But then the question really is, the interesting question to me is between decision 1 and decision 2 once that's happening. And I'm wondering what kinds of technologies are actually being worked on now that actually address that particular issue.
Yeah. Again, a great question. So I call this the envelope effect, and you can sort of abstract it down even in a scheduling problem. So if you miss task number 1 by a little bit, and then that affects when you start task number 2, and that also is missed by a bit, how much do you miss your deadline by? And I think some of the formulations that we would bring in is like a thresholding effect. Like how far, what is the percent by which I am? I mean, this is just a simple formulation, right? So how off am I with what I'm expecting to be, where I expect to be with this particular situation, and then replanning or rescheduling what we are doing, right? So again, it's a sequential decision-making process which takes into account all the different ways that you could land up. At least my work takes that approach. But if you keep missing what you expect, where you expect to be, and that adds up beyond a threshold, then I think you should hit the red button and redo things. Yeah.
Go back to that gentleman. Go ahead.
So, one question I had deals with the radiologist. How do you assure the radiologist, who may just think of his job as analyzing X-rays, that he himself is not going to really be out of a job, and somehow he's going to be a radiologist that can incorporate AI? And the other thing goes back to the geoengineering. Where are we in terms of geoengineering? I mean, you talked about an aerosol kind of a thing. What's the status of geoengineering to deal with that part of the graph? What's the cost to society? What's the political framework for that?
So I brought up the radiologist quote. So the way I see this, I think, again, this is vision technology and vision algorithms which have advanced so much, deep learning and so on. And they are probably doing pretty well with very specific defined problems, and in the average case, doing the right type of prediction. So I would say there are two concerns. One is when things are outliers, and I would think definitely, given what we have seen on the health side of just preterm babies and clinical data in vision, there can be similar issues, right? So we can, and this is related to health, and there are high costs to be wrong with your results. So I think that's why having the expert to handle the outliers would be one of the questions. And the other is, again, context. AI systems, we are still in the space of what is called narrow AI. We build systems which are very good at doing one thing, and maybe a couple of things which are similar. But we are nowhere close to where, how humans are able to assess what was this person's background, or what were they exposed to, and how does that affect the image screening that I'm looking at. So I think as we move towards what is called general AI, we have to take this into consideration. But I think the expertise that physicians bring in, sometimes they are just able to see the patient and take in thousands of features into account and make a decision on where they are in terms of risk. We are not there yet. We are very specific in that narrow areas AI space.
Where are we with geoengineering? So we are at, after a couple dozen peer-reviewed papers 15 years ago, exponential increase in scientific interest, which means we have a few hundred peer-reviewed papers, 850 or so. Much too little to make any kind of informed decision on whether it is even a good idea to contemplate. Or put differently, we are at the stage where national academies, for the 4th time by now, have come out with a report last spring in this case, saying we ought to do research, we ought to have a national research program, it ought to be open, transparent, and so on, right? Nobody owns the patent, and so on and so forth. It ought to be jump-starting governance conversations at the highest levels. Governance to me is, let's talk about it, right? Let's make sure we understand what it is. But frankly, and call me biased, founding executive director of Harvard's Zoology Engineering Research Program here, we ought to do a lot more fundamental research into the technology before we have any of these conversations about should we deploy zoology engineering at a global scale, never mind that nobody knows who the we is in this conversation.
So if I can be so bold to contrast this to the biology solution, we can already, if we enhance photosynthesis in plants by twofold, we can already say how much carbon drawdown there will be. And so, you know, it's a technology that I would say is ahead, and nature already does it. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do all things, which you made a very good point of, but I think, you know, there are technologies that they won't complete the solution, but they're good to go in term. They need more research. People are working on it, so that's good. But it's not all hope. There is stuff happening. More should be happening for sure.
And to be clear, it's not either or, right? We need, beggars can't be choosers, right? We need it all, and we needed it yesterday.
That's a good point. So okay, so I guess that completes our Q&A. All right. Yeah. So I think that's a good statement to end on. Beggars can't be choosers. So okay. Well, you know, many thanks to the 4 of you for your wonderful talks and Q&A and the audience.